Clay tablets buried for thousands of years are being read again, and what they contain shouldn't exist. Detailed instructions for engineering canals, tracking planets, measuring land, producing metals, and mixing medicines were written long before modern science claims these ideas began. Why were these technologies recorded, copied for centuries, then forgotten? Who first developed them? And what else is hidden inside the surviving fragments of Sumerian text waiting to be understood? The tablets that stayed unread in museum rooms. In the low light of museum storage, the most practical Sumerian writing often looks unimpressive. Many clay tablets are small enough to fit in a palm. Their surfaces are crowded with wedge marks that were pressed quickly, not carved for display. They were made for administrators, farmers, builders, and scribes who needed numbers to stay stable from one season to the next. For long stretches of modern time, those tablets sat boxed and catalogued without their content being understood, not because anyone hid them on purpose, but because the script had to be recovered step by step before the writing could be used again. Cuneiform began to be read in the 19th century through work on bilingual and trilingual inscriptions, especially in Akkadian and related scripts, and then through the slower task of learning Sumerian as a language preserved inside that writing system. The process did not end with a single decipherment moment. It continued as museums accumulated tablets from excavations, and scholars built reference lists of signs, grammar, and vocabulary, tablet by tablet. A large share of what we now call technical information from Sumer comes from that long, quiet phase of sorting and reading, not from dramatic discoveries in temples or tombs. Sumerian texts are not technical manuals in the modern sense, yet they preserve procedures with an unusual closeness to daily work. The writing is often prescriptive, built around sequences, quantities, and timing. The method is embedded in the choice of units, and the way a task is broken into repeatable steps. Where later cultures might leave process in oral tradition, Sumerian institutions had reasons to put process into writing, because grain and labour had to be allocated, measured, and defended against dispute. That pressure created a type of record where technology appears indirectly, as a system of actions that can be repeated by someone who did not invent it. The clearest example is agriculture, because agriculture in southern Mesopotamia depended on controlled water. Irrigation was not a single invention. It was a maintenance discipline shaped by canals that silted, banks that collapsed, and water that arrived unevenly. Sumerian tablets preserve the assumptions behind that discipline: measured fields, scheduled labour, seed quantities, and the timing of ploughing and harvesting. The technology is not a mysterious device. It is a set of coordinated tasks that only functions when the calendar, the tools, and the workforce align. One well-documented case sits inside a scholarly publication rather than a headline. In 1994, the Assyriologist Miguel Civil published The Farmer's Instructions, a Sumerian agricultural manual, a study and edition of a Sumerian text that survives in multiple cuneiform copies. The work is associated with the scribal tradition of Nippur, a major city and religious center in ancient Mesopotamia, where large tablet collections were excavated and dispersed into museum holdings. Civil treated the text as an agricultural instruction composition, not as literature detached from practice, and he reconstructed how the sequence of instructions was written and copied over time. The significance is not in a single line. It rests in the texture of the instructions, where action is organized across a season and tied to concrete operations, preparing the field, managing water, timing cultivation, and coordinating equipment and labor. The physical path of that knowledge into modern hands is traceable. The University of Pennsylvania's excavations at Nippur in 1889-1900 recovered tens of thousands of artifacts, including large numbers of tablets, which became foundational for the Penn Museum's collection and for Sumerian studies more broadly. Those tablets were not immediately readable as a practical archive. They had to be cleaned, sorted, copied by hand into drawings, and then compared across collections. The hidden quality, in this case, is the lag between excavation and usable reading. A procedure can exist in writing while being functionally inaccessible, simply because the writing system is no longer part of living practice. Within the farmer's instructions, the tone is matter-of-fact. The speaker voice is steady, and the emphasis falls on correct order. The text's focus on sequence mirrors how irrigation agriculture actually fails or succeeds. If a canal is cleared too late, water arrives when the soil cannot take it. If the field is ploughed before moisture is right, the ground breaks incorrectly. If seed is scattered without a prepared surface, germination becomes uneven. Sumerian scribes did not need to argue these points. They wrote as if the reader already accepted the constraints, and the writing served as a stabilizer, a way to keep the working year consistent across different hands. That same stabilizing impulse appears in measurement systems. Sumerian record-keeping relies on standardized units for capacity and area, and on numerical notation that can scale up for large institutional storage. The technology here is administrative, but it feeds directly into physical work. A grain ration tablet is also an engineering document, because it reflects how many workers can be supported for canal digging, brick carrying, or harvest labor. When these tablets are read in bulk, they show that the system was not occasional. It was continuous, which implies that measurement and accounting were treated as infrastructure, as necessary as wooden plows or reed boats. Building texts show a related pattern. The so-called Gudea cylinders, discovered in 1877 at Tello, the ruins of ancient Girsu, preserve a long Sumerian composition connected to temple construction under Gudea, ruler of Lagash. The cylinders are famous for their length, but they also matter for what they include in passing: materials sourced from different regions, the handling of brick and plaster, the organization of labor, and the sequencing of construction tasks. Much of the writing is framed in religious language, yet the practical content is present, and it is consistent with what archaeology shows about large-scale building in southern Mesopotamia. The text does not read like a blueprint. It reads like a narrative that assumes the reader understands how building work is done, and then anchors that work in formalized steps. Across these examples, lost technologies are often better described as lost reading access. The procedures were not secret to the people who used them. They were embedded in institutions that trained scribes and maintained archives. The loss came later, when the writing system fell out of use, and the tablets entered a long interval of silence. The recovery has been incremental and conservative, driven by editions, sign lists, museum catalogues, and digital projects that make tablet images and transliterations accessible to specialists. In a modern research context, the practical value of these texts depends on restraint. A Sumerian instruction composition cannot be treated as a complete manual for rebuilding an ancient farm because it assumes knowledge it does not explain. Even so, it can be used to document how people structured work, how they thought about timing, and how they standardized decisions across large systems. That is already a form of technology, because it is a repeatable method, preserved in a medium designed to outlast the person giving orders. The clay itself is part of the record. Tablets survive where wood, rope, and leather do not. That survival can distort attention, making writing seem like the main innovation. The broader picture is that writing preserved the coordination layer of Sumerian life. The tablets hold the quiet connective tissue between tools and outcomes: the count, the measure, the schedule, the instruction that turns a tool into a system, counting the hours without clocks. Clay tablets often record quantities with a precision that seems unexpectedly formal for a society that lacked mechanical clocks. The signs appear beside numbers, repeated in orderly patterns across columns. To a modern reader, the marks resemble accounting. In the early cities of Sumer, however, these notations form the basic framework for organizing labor, water flow, agricultural cycles, and ritual observances. Time, in this context, was not measured by devices but by agreed numerical divisions that appeared in written form long before physical instruments for keeping hours existed. Sumerian scribes used a numerical structure that modern scholars describe as sexagesimal, based on the number 60. The system appears consistently in administrative tablets from the late 3rd millennium BCE. This form of calculation allowed scribes to divide quantities into fractions that were practical for daily work. 1 hour could be broken into smaller units, just as a field could be divided into measured plots. The connection between time and measurement was therefore mathematical rather than mechanical. Cuneiform tablets show how scribes represented those divisions, using combinations of wedge-shaped marks that expressed both whole numbers and fractional values. The practical use of that system appears most clearly in economic texts discovered during excavations in southern Iraq. Beginning in the 19th century, archaeological expeditions uncovered tens of thousands of clay tablets from cities such as Ur, Lagash, and Umma. Many of these tablets were administrative records produced under the centralized bureaucracies of the Ur-3 period, roughly between 2112 BCE and 2004 BCE. They recorded the movement of grain, livestock, textiles, and laborers across the territories controlled by the state. Embedded within these records are repeated references to time intervals expressed through standardized units. One documented example comes from the archives of Umma, a major administrative center in southern Mesopotamia during the reign of King Shulgi of the 3rd dynasty of Ur. Thousands of tablets from Umma were excavated in the early 20th century and later catalogued in museum collections, including those at the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago. These texts record labor assignments for canal maintenance, agricultural planting, and transport duties. Many of the tablets include the unit known as the ush, a measurement associated with time and distance. The presence of this unit indicates that scribes were not only tracking quantities of goods, but were also defining how long specific tasks were expected to take. The significance of the Umma tablets lies in their consistency. Similar expressions appear across hundreds of documents written by different scribes. Workers assigned to canal dredging or field preparation were credited with specific labor periods measured through these standardized intervals. The tablets also include date formulas tied to royal years, such as year Shulgi destroyed the city of Sumerian, providing chronological anchors for modern historians. Because these records were written daily within a functioning bureaucracy, they preserve an ongoing system rather than an isolated description. Scholarly study of these texts expanded during the 20th century as cuneiform collections were photographed and published in systematic editions. Assyriologist Robert K. Englund of the University of California, Los Angeles, has examined large groups of administrative tablets from the Ur-3 period, focusing on numerical notation and economic organization. His research demonstrated that the sexagesimal system functioned as a flexible tool, capable of expressing both large totals and precise fractional divisions. This capability allowed scribes to allocate resources with a level of numerical consistency that was unusual for early urban societies. Timekeeping in these texts does not appear as an abstract concept. Instead, it emerges through routine institutional activities. Irrigation canals required periodic clearing to prevent blockage from silt deposits carried by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Tablets describing canal work often specify the number of laborers assigned and the expected duration of the task. The calculation of time, therefore, became part of a logistical framework linking measurement, manpower, and agricultural survival. Another dimension of the system appears in temple archives, where ritual schedules were recorded with comparable precision. Temples in cities such as Nippur and Ur maintained daily offerings, seasonal festivals, and rotating duties for priests and workers. Clay tablets from these institutions contain lists of supplies issued at regular intervals, implying that the scribes responsible for those records relied on stable temporal divisions. The repetition of numerical patterns across these documents suggests that the same mathematical framework governed both economic and religious operations. Evidence for the durability of the sexagesimal system appears in later Babylonian astronomical texts. Although these documents date many centuries after the earliest Sumerian records, they retain the same numerical structure. Babylonian astronomers expressed angular measurements and celestial calculations using divisions based on 60. Modern timekeeping still reflects this structure through the division of an hour into 60 minutes and a minute into 60 seconds. The continuity illustrates how a mathematical approach to time, first visible in administrative writing, could persist long after the original institutions disappeared. The historical path that brought these tablets into modern scholarship is well documented. Excavations at sites such as Tel Joker, the ancient city of Umma, began in the early 20th century under the direction of archaeologists working with the Ottoman and later Iraqi authorities. Tablets recovered during these operations were distributed to museums and universities in Europe and the United States. Over the following decades, specialists catalogued and translated the material, gradually reconstructing the bureaucratic landscape of the Ur-3 state. Digital archiving has expanded access to these records in recent years. Projects such as the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, established in 1998, provide online photographs and transliterations of thousands of tablets. Researchers can now compare texts from different collections without traveling to each museum. The ability to analyze large numbers of administrative records has clarified how numerical notation was applied consistently across multiple cities and administrative centers. The clay tablets themselves do not describe mechanical devices for measuring hours. No evidence from Sumerian texts indicates the use of clock-like instruments during the early 3rd millennium BCE. Instead, the written records reveal a conceptual framework in which time was expressed through numerical ratios and standardized intervals embedded within bureaucratic procedures. Scribes relied on mathematical regularity to coordinate work, maintain records, and ensure that institutional activities followed a predictable rhythm. Through the quiet accumulation of these administrative texts, the numerical organization of time in ancient Mesopotamia becomes visible. The tablets record labor periods, resource allocations, and ritual schedules through consistent mathematical notation. The system functioned without physical clocks, relying instead on shared numerical conventions preserved in clay writing. Lines pressed into clay that define the shape of land. Across the river plains of southern Mesopotamia, agricultural land did not exist as vague stretches of open soil. Fields had edges, lengths, corners, and irrigation boundaries that were recognized by institutions and by the people who worked them. The evidence for this structure appears in cuneiform tablets where scribes recorded dimensions using standardized measures of area and length. Those clay documents, written thousands of years ago, preserve the procedures used to calculate the size of fields and to define the geometry of irrigation agriculture. The marks are small and repetitive, but they reflect a consistent method for translating physical space into numerical description. The cities of Sumer were built on low alluvial terrain shaped by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Seasonal flooding deposited layers of fine sediment that could be cultivated once water was directed through canals and levees. Because fields could expand, shift, or merge as waterways changed, accurate measurement became necessary for administration. Land distribution, taxation, and agricultural planning all depended on reliable dimensions. Sumerian tablets demonstrate that this measurement was expressed through defined units, most notably the iku, a unit of area used throughout Mesopotamian records. The iku appears frequently in tablets dating to the 3rd millennium BCE. In later mathematical interpretation, one iku corresponds to approximately 3,600 square meters. Tablets do not describe the unit abstractly. Instead, they list dimensions of fields expressed as combinations of length and width. These figures allowed scribes to calculate the total area and assign that value to farmers, temples, or administrative offices. The procedure suggests that land was conceptualized through rectangular geometry, where area could be derived from linear measurements recorded in standard units. Evidence for these practices comes from large collections of administrative texts excavated during archaeological expeditions in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Excavations at Nippur, carried out by the University of Pennsylvania between 1889 and 1900, uncovered thousands of tablets from scribal schools and temple archives. Many of those documents contain references to field boundaries, crop yields, and irrigation responsibilities. When scholars compared the tablets, they found repeated patterns in how measurements were written. The consistent structure suggests that scribes followed established surveying conventions rather than improvising calculations. A particularly detailed example was studied by the Assyriologist Eleanor Robson, whose research on Mesopotamian mathematics examined tablets describing land division and area calculation. One tablet from the Old Babylonian period, now housed in the British Museum and catalogued as BM 85194, contains a mathematical problem concerning a rectangular field whose sides are expressed in standard length units. The tablet demonstrates how scribes multiplied those dimensions to determine area. Although the text dates to a later period than early Sumerian administration, the procedure it records reflects a mathematical tradition that developed from earlier surveying practices. Surveying in southern Mesopotamia relied on physical reference points as well as written calculation. Boundary markers were sometimes set along field edges to indicate ownership or irrigation responsibility. Inscriptions describing such markers appear in both administrative texts and legal documents. The markers themselves rarely survive because they were made of materials that could erode or be reused, but the written records provide a durable reference. Tablets describe how fields were measured from one landmark to another, using canals, levees, or paths as fixed boundaries. A well-documented case involving boundary measurement appears in inscriptions associated with the ruler Entemena of Lagash, who governed in the 24th century BCE. Several clay cones and inscriptions from his reign describe the resolution of a territorial dispute between the cities of Lagash and Umma. These texts, discovered at the site of Tello during French excavations led by Ernest de Sarzec, beginning in 1877, describe how boundary lines were restored after previous conflicts. The inscriptions record the re-establishment of markers that defined agricultural land between the two territories. Although written in a political context, the texts demonstrate the importance of accurate surveying in maintaining agricultural infrastructure. Within the Lagash inscriptions, land boundaries are described through measurable distances and through reference to irrigation features. The canals that carried water from the Tigris formed practical dividing lines between territories. Because canals required constant maintenance, they also served as stable reference points for surveyors. The relationship between irrigation and measurement is evident in many administrative tablets where canal sections are listed alongside adjacent fields. The spatial arrangement recorded in these texts shows that surveying was integrated into the operation of irrigation networks. Another dimension of land measurement appears in tablets recording agricultural yield. These documents often list the area of a field followed by the quantity of grain harvested. By comparing the two figures, scribes could evaluate productivity or calculate obligations owed to temples or state authorities. The numerical relationship between field size and crop output indicates that measurement was used not only to define property, but also to monitor agricultural performance. This connection between geometry and yield created a practical incentive for maintaining accurate surveying methods. Archaeological research in southern Iraq has reinforced the information contained in these texts. Surveys conducted in the 20th century by archaeologists such as Robert McCormick Adams examined the remains of ancient canal systems and settlement patterns. Adams' work in the Diyala and lower Mesopotamian regions demonstrated how agricultural landscapes were organized around irrigation networks that extended for many kilometers. The patterns observed in those surveys correspond closely with the administrative descriptions preserved in tablets, suggesting that the written records reflect real spatial arrangements rather than abstract models. The scribal training required to maintain these records appears in educational tablets recovered from sites such as Nippur and Ur. Students practiced writing numerical tables and copying measurement exercises on small clay tablets known as school texts. These exercises included multiplication tables and examples involving the calculation of areas. The presence of such training materials indicates that surveying and numerical calculation formed part of the professional preparation for scribes working in administrative institutions. Cuneiform tablets describing land measurement rarely contain narrative explanations. The text is typically concise, presenting numbers and place references without commentary. Yet when these records are examined collectively, they reveal a systematic method for translating land into measurable units. Fields were defined by length and width, canals served as reference lines, and boundaries were confirmed through written documentation. The clay tablets preserved the numerical description of terrain long after the physical markers disappeared. Waterwork notes, written for people who had to maintain them. Canal systems were not treated as background scenery. They were managed as working structures that demanded constant attention, recorded obligations, and predictable scheduling. The written record reflects that attitude. Cuneiform tablets do not present hydraulic engineering as a separate discipline with diagrams and theory. They preserve it as routine governance, expressed through assignments, rations, measurements, and place names tied to specific channels and embankments. Irrigation in Sumer depended on a landscape that could not hold its shape without intervention. The lower Tigris and Euphrates plains carried fine sediment that settled into canal beds. Water levels changed with season, and banks softened when flow was high. A canal that was left alone could narrow, fill, or breach. Repair did not happen as a rare emergency. It took place as planned labour, organised by administrators who treated dredging and bank work as recurring tasks that had to be documented. Texts from the Ur-3 period make this visible with unusual clarity because the state produced an enormous volume of administrative writing. The Ur-3 state, dated roughly to 2112, 2004 BCE under the Middle Chronology, depended on intensive cultivation and on the movement of grain and goods between cities. That economy required canals for both irrigation and transport. Administrative tablets show that water management was integrated into the same accounting systems used for barley, livestock, and textiles. When canals were dredged, the work was expressed in rations and days, recorded in the same sober format as any other institutional obligation. Hydraulic knowledge appears here as a combination of materials, timing, and labor control. Canal dredging required tools for cutting and lifting silt, baskets or containers for hauling spoil, and coordinated teams to keep the channel open while maintaining stable banks. Levees had to be built up and compacted. Water had to be distributed through smaller branches without stripping one area dry or flooding another. Tablets address these realities indirectly by showing what the institutions paid for and what they tracked. The things that mattered most, such as the duration of work and the amount of food issued, were written down consistently. A well-documented case survives as a single receipt-like record tied to a named canal. A publication from the University of Liverpool's repository presents Ur-3 tablets from Iris Arig in the Iraq Museum, including a document described as remuneration for work dredging the Mama, Sharat Canal. The text is framed as a receipt, set in the administrative language of distribution rather than narrative description. It records payment in barley measured as a daily ration, calculated for a specific number of days, and tied to the act of dredging a particular channel. The document's interest is practical. It shows that canal maintenance was treated as measurable labour with a defined rate of compensation, recorded in writing as a matter of procedure. The structure of that record points toward the kind of hydraulic management the state expected. A fixed daily allotment implies that workdays were counted, and that the institution recognised dredging as a category of labour with predictable duration. The use of barley as remuneration places canal work within the broader ration economy of the Ur-3 state. The mention of a named canal suggests that channels were identified as discrete assets, not as anonymous waterways. A canal could therefore be tracked in the same way a storehouse or a herd could be tracked, through the people assigned to it and the inputs consumed to keep it operating. The hydraulic problem behind dredging is not complicated to describe, but it is complicated to sustain. Silt builds gradually and is easy to ignore until flow slows. Vegetation can take hold in shallow sections. A canal that begins to clog changes how water reaches fields downstream. The administrative response, as reflected by a dredging remuneration record, is to normalize the task. Dredging becomes something that can be scheduled, staffed, and accounted for without debate. The tablet does not explain what dredging is. It assumes that the activity is familiar enough to be referenced without definition, which is often the strongest indicator that the procedure was institutionalized. Irrigation also required control structures that altered flow without requiring constant rebuilding. Weirs and regulated openings are difficult to see archaeologically in their original materials because wood and reeds decay, and earthworks are reshaped by later use. Written references to such structures, even when brief, help anchor them as planned interventions rather than improvised fixes. Museum collection records include artifacts bearing inscriptions that credit kings with building water control installations, such as a piece described by the University of Chicago's Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures as a handwritten inscription stating that Shulgi built a weir for the goddess Ninfursag. That kind of statement does not provide engineering specifications, but it shows that constructing flow control works was important enough to be commemorated and linked to legitimate authority. The distance between commemorative inscriptions and administrative receipts is instructive. Royal statements frame waterworks as durable achievements tied to divine favour and public order. Administrative receipts frame waterworks as constant expenditure and routine maintenance. Both forms of writing point to the same reality. Irrigation was a system that did not run on its own. The largest construction could be undermined by months of neglect, while steady maintenance could keep modest channels functioning across generations. Tablets also imply a relationship between canal work and the seasonal rhythm of agriculture. Dredging and bank repair are most effective when timed around planting and harvest cycles, when water demand and field conditions are predictable. The Ur-3 bureaucracy tracked time through month names and year formulas. When canal work was recorded as a number of days within a month, it implicitly connected labour scheduling to the agricultural calendar. A ration calculated for 30 days, like the one described in the Iris Arig text, fits into that framework as a full month's allocation to a specific maintenance task. Hydraulic knowledge in these records is therefore more administrative than descriptive, but it is still technical. It requires stable metrology, consistent ration rates, and an agreed classification of labour. It requires a naming system for channels and a habit of recording where work occurred. It requires institutions capable of moving food to workers and workers to canal sites. Those are the components that turn irrigation from local improvisation into regional infrastructure. Modern access to this material has improved because tablet corpora are increasingly searchable and comparable across collections. The Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative is one example of an international effort to provide images and standardized transliterations for large numbers of cuneiform texts. When canal-related tablets are examined at scale, they show repeated administrative patterns that align with what is known about Ur-3 labor organization and state-managed agriculture. The result is not a hidden blueprint, it is a stable outline of how water management was embedded in daily governance. The Mama Sharat dredging record stays useful because it is small and specific. It ties a hydraulic task to payment, time, and place without decoration. It shows that canal maintenance could be reduced to countable work and recorded as a controlled exchange. The tablet's language is not explanatory, and it does not need to be, because it was written for people who already understood that a canal only remained a canal when someone kept removing what the river kept putting back. Heat managed through records of kilns and metal. Craft production in early Mesopotamian cities relied on controlled heat as much as it relied on raw materials. Clay vessels hardened only when exposed to sustained temperatures. Metal tools and ornaments required melting, casting, and repeated reheating. Workshops that handled these tasks did not operate casually. Their activities were organized through institutions that issued materials, monitored output, and recorded the use of fuel. Clay tablets from cities such as Ur, Nippur, and Lagash preserve traces of this organization. They show that the management of heat was treated as an administrative responsibility, rather than a private craft secret. The earliest metal objects in southern Mesopotamia date to the late 4th and early 3rd millennia BCE. Copper was the primary metal used during that period, often alloyed with small amounts of arsenic or other elements. Archaeological finds from sites such as Ur reveal that copper tools, weapons, and decorative objects were produced in considerable quantities. The metal itself did not originate in the alluvial plains of southern Iraq. It had to be imported from regions such as Oman or the Iranian plateau. Because the raw material was scarce and valuable, the process of transforming copper into finished objects was closely supervised. Administrative tablets from the 3rd millennium BCE record deliveries of copper ingots and the distribution of finished metal items to temples or state officials. These tablets rarely describe the smelting process in technical language. Instead, they present lists of materials entering and leaving institutional workshops. The records demonstrate that metalworking took place under the authority of large organizations that tracked inventory with precision. The presence of such documentation suggests that the control of furnaces and casting operations was integrated into broader economic management. Evidence for the structure of these workshops appears in the archives of the city of Ur during the Ur-3 period. Tablets from this era frequently list metal objects alongside the names of craftsmen responsible for producing them. One group of texts records the work of smiths identified by professional titles such as simug, the Sumerian term for metal worker. These craftsmen received quantities of copper and were expected to deliver finished items that matched the weight of the material issued to them. The administrative system therefore monitored both the input and the output of metal production. Archaeological discoveries at Ur reinforce the written record. Excavations directed by Sir Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934 uncovered numerous metal artifacts in royal tombs and domestic contexts. Among these objects were copper tools, weapons, vessels, and decorative fittings that display advanced casting techniques. The variety and quality of the objects suggest the existence of organized workshops capable of maintaining stable furnace temperatures and producing repeated forms. The artifacts correspond with the administrative tablets that track copper allocation to craftsmen. Clay production followed a similar institutional pattern. Pottery was essential for storage, transport, and daily use throughout Mesopotamian society. Large-scale pottery manufacture required kilns capable of maintaining high temperatures for extended periods. Archaeological excavations at sites such as Nippur and Uruk have revealed the remains of kiln structures, including circular chambers with vents designed to regulate airflow. These installations indicate that potters controlled combustion carefully to achieve consistent firing conditions. Administrative texts associated with pottery production often record the movement of clay vessels in large numbers. Tablets list jars, bowls, and storage containers issued to temples, storehouses, or agricultural estates. The quantities involved imply a coordinated production system rather than isolated household craft. Potters working for institutions likely operated in designated workshops, where kilns could be maintained and fuel supplies could be monitored. Fuel management played a critical role in sustaining these operations. Southern Mesopotamia lacked abundant timber resources, which meant that potters and metalworkers relied on alternative fuels such as reed bundles, brushwood, or dried animal dung. Administrative tablets occasionally record the distribution of these materials to workshops. The presence of such entries indicates that the supply of fuel was organized through the same bureaucratic channels that controlled metal and clay. Scholarly examination of Mesopotamian metallurgy has clarified how these systems functioned. Research by archaeometallurgists has shown that early copper objects were typically produced through casting rather than forging. Molten metal was poured into molds made from clay or stone, creating tools or decorative forms that required minimal reshaping afterward. The process demanded sustained temperatures above 1000 degrees Celsius, which could only be achieved through well-constructed furnaces and controlled airflow. Evidence for molds used in casting has been recovered from several archaeological sites. Clay molds discovered at the city of Gersu, the ancient center of Lagash, contain impressions corresponding to tools and weapons found elsewhere in Mesopotamian contexts. The molds show that craftsmen prepared standardized forms before pouring molten metal into them. This approach allowed workshops to produce multiple objects with similar shapes and dimensions. Written records from the city of Lagash provide additional context for the organization of craft labor. Tablets dating to the reign of rulers such as Gudea describe the allocation of materials and the supervision of specialized workers within temple complexes. Metalworkers, potters, carpenters, and other craftsmen were listed among the labor forces attached to these institutions. Their work supported both religious construction projects and the everyday functioning of the city. Kilns and furnaces were therefore not isolated installations scattered randomly across the landscape. They operated within administrative frameworks that tracked resources, labor, and output. Clay tablets served as the written backbone of these systems. They preserved numerical records that linked materials to specific workshops and craftsmen. Modern understanding of Mesopotamian craft production has benefited from laboratory analysis of archaeological materials. Metallurgical examination of copper artifacts has revealed traces of casting techniques, alloy compositions, and finishing methods. These studies confirm that ancient craftsmen maintained consistent production practices across different cities and centuries. The artifacts match the expectations implied by administrative records describing the movement of copper and finished tools. Access to these records has expanded through digital archiving projects that make cuneiform tablets available to researchers worldwide. Databases containing photographs and transliterations of tablets allow specialists to compare documents from different collections and identify patterns in the administration of craft production. When examined together, the texts demonstrate that workshop activities were embedded within a larger economic system that coordinated materials, labor, and distribution. Furnaces and kilns left physical traces in the archaeological record, but the clay tablets preserved the administrative structure that sustained them. The written documents do not attempt to describe flames, temperatures, or metallurgical theory. Instead, they record deliveries of copper, the names of craftsmen, and the quantities of finished goods returned to storehouses. These quiet entries form a durable record of how controlled heat became part of a managed production system in early Mesopotamian cities. Plants named on tablets used for treatment. Healing practices recorded in early cuneiform tablets revolve around substances that could be gathered, measured, and combined. Lists of plants, minerals, oils, and animal products appear repeatedly within the writing. These records are often brief and arranged in narrow columns, yet they reveal a structured understanding of treatment built around observation and preparation. The tablets rarely explain the reasoning behind each mixture. Instead, they preserve the ingredients and the order in which those ingredients were applied, indicating that the practical sequence of treatment mattered as much as the materials themselves. Knowledge about plants occupied a central place within this written tradition. Scribes copied long lexical lists that grouped plants according to name and usage. These lists functioned as reference texts for students learning the professional vocabulary required for medical practice. Many of the entries correspond to plants that can be identified through modern botanical study, including varieties of willow, juniper, mustard, and tamarisk. Each plant name was paired with specific contexts in which it might be used, such as poultices, drinks, or ointments. Clay tablets preserving medical recipes date largely to the early 2nd millennium BCE and later periods, although they reflect traditions that likely developed earlier. One example is a group of tablets excavated at the city of Nippur during the University of Pennsylvania expedition at the end of the 19th century. These tablets include instructions for preparing treatments involving crushed plants mixed with oils or beer. The records were catalogued and studied during the 20th century, revealing that healers working in temple environments relied on standardized mixtures prepared in measured quantities. The format of these prescriptions follows a recognizable pattern. A typical entry begins with the description of a condition affecting the body. The tablet then lists ingredients to be gathered and describes how they should be prepared. Grinding, boiling, soaking, and mixing appear as common actions. The text concludes with instructions for applying the treatment, which might involve drinking the mixture, spreading it over the skin, or using it as a fumigation. One well-documented text associated with early medical knowledge is the Nippur medical tablet, which dates to approximately 2000 BCE. The tablet is preserved today in the University of Pennsylvania Museum and is often cited as one of the earliest known written collections of medical prescriptions. It contains several treatments involving plant-based ingredients combined with substances such as salt or beer. The document was first analyzed in detail by historian Samuel Noah Kramer during the 20th century. Kramer noted that the prescriptions lack references to incantations, focusing instead on practical preparation of substances. The structure of the Nippur tablet suggests that healers maintained a body of recorded treatments that could be consulted repeatedly. Each recipe is concise, relying on terminology that would have been familiar to trained practitioners. The absence of elaborate explanation implies that the intended reader already understood how to recognize symptoms and how to gather the required ingredients. Botanical knowledge expanded through contact with diverse landscapes. Plants recorded in medical tablets were not limited to those growing in cultivated fields. Some ingredients originated in marshlands, others in upland regions beyond the river plains. Trade routes and administrative networks allowed institutions to acquire materials from distant locations. Tablets occasionally mention imported resins or aromatic woods used in treatment, indicating that healers incorporated substances that were transported through broader economic systems. The preparation of medicine required tools similar to those used in other crafts. Grinding stones, ceramic vessels, and heating containers appear in archaeological contexts associated with temples and domestic spaces. Residue analysis conducted on some vessels has revealed traces of plant compounds consistent with medicinal use. These findings correspond with the written instructions that describe boiling plant material or mixing powders into liquids. Professional roles connected with healing appear in administrative texts as well. The practitioner known as the Asu specialized in preparing remedies and applying treatments based on practical knowledge of plants and substances. Another figure, the Ashipu, performed rituals and incantations associated with illness. Tablets indicate that these roles could operate side by side, reflecting a medical system that combined empirical preparation with ritual practice. The Nippur medical tablet stands out because it emphasizes the material aspect of treatment rather than ritual elements. Archaeological and textual research has gradually clarified how this knowledge circulated. Clay tablets containing medical information were copied within scribal schools, where students learned specialized vocabulary. The repetition of plant names and preparation terms across different tablets suggests that these texts formed part of a recognized curriculum. Students practice writing the recipes while also memorizing the ingredients and procedures. Scholars studying these tablets rely on comparisons with modern botanical taxonomy to identify the plants described in cuneiform. This process involves matching ancient names with species known to grow in the region or recorded in later traditions. Some identifications remain uncertain because plant names could refer to several related species. Even so, a substantial number of ingredients have been linked to known plants with medicinal properties, supporting the interpretation that the treatments were grounded in observation of their effects. The clay tablets themselves provide only the outline of this system. They record ingredients, measurements, and preparation methods without describing the environment where the plants were collected or the experiences of the patients treated with them. Those details must be reconstructed through archaeology and comparative study. What remains visible in the writing is the careful documentation of substances that could be measured, ground, boiled, and administered as remedies. Night notes, filed beside tax receipts. Clay tablets that track grain and labour often sit in the same museum drawers as tablets that track the sky. The writing looks similar at first glance, with lines of short wedges and numerical signs pressed into an even surface. The difference appears in the subject matter. Instead of listing rations, the tablets name stars, mark days in a lunar month, and record moments when a bright planet disappears and returns. The documents read like working notes intended to keep schedules stable, the kind of writing that helps an institution avoid drifting out of sync with the seasons. Calendar control depended on observation rather than instruments. Months began with the first visibility of the new moon, and the year had to stay aligned with agricultural cycles that did not fit neatly into 12 lunar months. The written record shows scribes managing that mismatch through repeated observation, numerical notation, and conventions for recording visibility in a standardized way. The same habits used for weighing wool or counting jars were applied to the night sky, because both required regularity and agreement. Astronomical material survives in different genres. Some tablets preserve star lists and schematic calendars used for instruction. Others preserve omen series where celestial events were treated as signs, but even those texts rely on carefully recorded observations. The practical layer remains visible because the omens are anchored to specific phenomena and specific dates, which force scribes to maintain consistent descriptive language. When a text states that a planet was first seen on a given day, that statement only works if the day counting and the observational practice are already stable. A well-documented case shows this clearly in a single object that can be checked in a museum catalogue. The British Museum holds a fragment, identified as K160, described as a copy of the so-called Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa, excavated at Koyunjik, the mound of ancient Nineveh, during 19th century work associated with Austin Henry Layard. The tablet is part of a larger textual tradition known as Enuma Anu Enlil Tablet. 63, transmitted in multiple copies. A modern scholarly edition of that tablet within the series Babylonian Planetary Omens was published by Erica Reiner and David Pingree in 1975, indicating that the text has been treated as a core witness for how observers recorded Venus phenomena in a formalized way. The interest of the Venus tablet is not that it contains a single spectacular claim. It is that it preserves a narrow type of data over an extended run of time. The text records the first and last visibility of Venus relative to sunrise and sunset, expressed through lunar dates and organized by regnal years. This is a document type that only makes sense when observers return to the horizon repeatedly and write down what they see in a consistent format. The observations were later copied into library collections, suggesting that the information was treated as reusable reference material rather than a one-time note. The path into modern scholarship is unusually traceable. K160 is explicitly tied in the British Museum's catalogue to the Library of Ashurbanipal and to excavation at Koyunjik. That library was part of a larger collection of tens of thousands of tablets and fragments, recovered from the ruins of Nineveh and later assembled in museum collections, a process that shaped which scientific and technical texts were available for study. The library context matters because it explains why astronomical texts survive in multiple copies. They were not stored as private notebooks. They were treated as part of a curated corpus, collected and recopied. The Venus tablet is often discussed through chronology debates, but the more stable point is methodological. A record of planetary visibility requires controlled language and careful day counting. The observer has to distinguish between a last visibility and a temporary failure to see the planet due to haze or dust. The text format implies routines for watching and for writing, likely supported by trained scribes who could align what was seen with the calendar that administrators used. The writing does not describe the observer's posture or location. It preserves the administrative outcome, a date tied to visibility, suitable for copying. Astronomical material did not remain confined to one series. Another strand appears in the compendium known as Mull, Apin, a set of texts that collects star lists, risings, and settings, and schematic information used for organizing the year. Modern scholarship treats Mull, Apin, as a major astronomical reference work, surviving in first millennium copies even if its underlying composition draws on earlier tradition. A published modern edition by Herman Hunger and John Steele frames it as the earliest surviving general work of its kind, gathering theoretical and practical information about the sun, moon, stars, and planets. The British Museum catalogues a fragment, Remember 319, as part of Mull, Apin, and ties it as well to the Library of Ashurbanipal through its collection history. MUL. Apin material looks different from a single run of Venus observations. It functions more like a structured reference, laying out star names and seasonal markers in a form that can be taught and reused. The fact that it survives in library fragments alongside omen texts suggests that institutional readers did not divide astronomy neatly from other kinds of knowledge. A tablet could serve instruction, scheduling, and divinatory interpretation at the same time, while still relying on concrete observation. The overlap with administration becomes clearer when celestial tracking is treated as a calendar tool rather than as a philosophical exercise. Agricultural work depended on predictable seasonal shifts, but lunar months drift against the solar year. Observations of stellar risings and settings, organized schematically, provide anchor points that can be checked without instruments. When those anchors are written down, they become portable across generations of scribes. The value lies in repeatability. A horizon event can be compared year to year, and the comparison can be expressed through the same numerical habits used for work assignments. Modern access has altered how this material can be analysed without changing what the tablets contain. The Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative has been one of the projects aimed at making cuneiform tablet images and text data broadly available, spanning tablets from the beginning of writing through the end of the pre-Christian era. That kind of access matters for astronomy because patterns often emerge only when multiple witnesses are compared. A fragment in one collection can be matched to a parallel in another, and the repeated use of numerical signs can be studied across genres. The record for Venus in particular also survives in tablets outside the Nineveh library context. The British Museum's collection includes other tablets identified as Enuma Anu Enlil, 63, including an object catalogued as 32107, described as an astrological omens tablet belonging to the Venus tablet tradition and associated with Babylon as a find spot. The existence of multiple museum-catalogued exemplars underscores that this was a transmitted text with a copying history, not a solitary observation log. The copying implies demand, and demand implies institutional use. The practical effect of this writing is visible without assigning motives. A temple or palace that tracks lunar dates and horizon events gains a stronger grip on scheduling, whether the schedule involves offerings, labor rotations, or agricultural timing. The texts do not announce that purpose directly. They show the infrastructure of it, the stable recording of dates and events. The same clay medium that preserves barley accounts preserves the framework for a year that can be kept orderly even when the moon and the seasons refuse to line up neatly. Visibility records and star compendia do not need to explain themselves to the people who used them. They were written for readers trained to accept the format and to apply it. A line about a planet's last appearance does not read like a revelation. It reads like a notation that belongs in a system where tomorrow's calendar must match tonight's sky well enough to keep the next month from arriving too early or too late. Hands that copied knowledge long after the work was done. Rows of cuneiform signs on clay rarely represent a single moment of writing. Many tablets surviving today are the result of copying that occurred centuries after the original text was composed. The clay surface preserves the act of transmission rather than the moment of invention. Scribes trained in temple schools or royal libraries reproduced earlier material line by line, sometimes preserving mistakes, sometimes correcting them, and sometimes rearranging passages to fit new collections. The writing therefore reflects a long chain of reproduction through which technical knowledge continued to exist, even when the practical circumstances that first produced it had already changed. Scribal copying served multiple purposes. Students learned writing through repeated transcription of authoritative texts. Libraries gathered earlier compositions to preserve institutional memory. Administrative offices required standardized wording for procedures that had to remain stable over generations. Technical information was often preserved through these same mechanisms, embedded inside documents that scribes treated as reliable reference points. Tablet collections discovered in the ruins of ancient cities reveal how widespread this practice was. Excavations conducted during the 19th century uncovered large archives containing tablets written in different centuries but preserving the same textual traditions. When scholars compared these copies, They noticed that the structure of many texts remained remarkably stable even when individual signs differed slightly. This pattern suggests that scribes followed exemplars earlier tablets used as models for reproduction. The library assembled during the reign of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BCE provides one of the clearest examples of this process. Archaeologists excavating the palace complex at Nineveh uncovered thousands of clay tablets belonging to this royal collection. The tablets were not limited to historical or literary works. They included technical writings, lexical lists, medical recipes, astronomical records, and administrative compilations gathered from earlier traditions. Many of these tablets were copied from older sources. Colophons written at the end of certain texts identify the scribes responsible for the copying, and sometimes mention that the tablet was produced as a faithful reproduction of an earlier original. These statements reveal a deliberate effort to preserve older knowledge. The copying was not casual practice writing. It was an organized activity intended to maintain a complete archive. Evidence of this effort appears in catalogue entries preserved on clay tablets themselves. One catalogue tablet discovered at Nineveh lists titles of works belonging to the scholarly series known as Enuma Anu Enlil, which contains extensive astronomical and meteorological observations. The catalogue demonstrates that scribes were aware of the structure of their collections and attempted to organize texts according to recognized series. This type of documentation shows that copying was part of a systematic archival program. The process of reproduction inevitably introduced variation. Differences between tablet copies appear in spelling, arrangement of lines, and occasionally in numerical notation. These differences provide modern scholars with clues about how texts moved between regions and generations of scribes. A tablet copied in one city might preserve local conventions or adjustments made by the scribe responsible for the new version. Scholarly research into these textual families has revealed that certain compositions were copied repeatedly for centuries. Astronomical texts, lexical lists, and medical compilations appear in copies produced at widely separated times. The persistence of these texts suggests that they served as reference works consulted by specialists, rather than as documents tied to a single historical event. Tablet fragments from different collections often belong to the same textual tradition. A fragment preserved in one museum may correspond to another fragment held elsewhere. When these pieces are compared, they reveal the structure of the original composition and the pattern of copying through which it survived. Modern digital catalogues allow researchers to reconstruct such relationships by comparing photographs and transliterations across collections. The practice of copying also influenced how knowledge was presented. Scribes sometimes organized material into numbered sequences or standardized lists that could be reproduced efficiently. This format reduced the likelihood of omissions during copying and helped students memorize the order of information. Lexical lists of plants, animals, metals, and technical terms illustrate this approach clearly. Each entry followed the same pattern, making the text easier to replicate accurately. Clay itself contributed to the preservation of these traditions. A tablet could be stored for centuries without significant degradation if kept dry. When cities were destroyed or abandoned, the tablets often remained buried beneath collapsed buildings. The same medium that recorded everyday transactions also safeguarded technical material that would otherwise have disappeared. Archaeological recovery of these archives has gradually restored access to the copying tradition. Tablets from Nineveh, Nippur, and other sites were distributed to museums and universities, where scholars began cataloguing them in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Early publications presented hand-drawn copies of the inscriptions, allowing specialists to compare texts across different collections. Later advances in photography and digital imaging improved the ability to document the tablets accurately. High-resolution images now allow researchers to examine small variations in wedge impressions that indicate how a sign was formed. These details sometimes reveal the individual style of the scribe who produced the copy. Modern scholarship therefore treats each tablet not only as a source of information, but also as evidence of a copying event. The form of the writing, the arrangement of lines, and the colophon statements all contribute to understanding how knowledge circulated through scribal communities. Technical information survived not because it was preserved in a single authoritative document, but because generations of scribes reproduced it repeatedly. The tablets show that written knowledge could persist even when its original environment changed. A medical recipe copied in a palace library might have originated centuries earlier in a temple workshop. An astronomical observation written during one dynasty could be copied again during another, preserving the numerical structure of the earlier record. Clay fragments scattered across modern museums therefore represent the outcome of a long process of transmission. Each fragment records a moment when a scribe pressed a stylus into wet clay to reproduce a text considered worth preserving. The act of copying ensured that practical knowledge remained accessible long after the circumstances that first produced it had faded from memory. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing for more deep dive history like this. Leave your thoughts in the comments and let us know what topic you'd like us to explore next. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.